"Get off that piano, kid. This isn't your stage." A harsh voice cuts through the morning stillness as a homeless boy's fingers hover over the keys. The officer's words are cold, sharp, but the boy says nothing. Instead, he begins to play. What follows leaves the entire city square frozen. The angry cop begins to tremble. Tears form, and a hidden past, long buried in silence, resurfaces through a melody so haunting it changes everything. This is the unforgettable story of Elias, a homeless child with a gift no one saw coming, and a piano that carried more than sound. It carried truth, healing, and redemption. Through heartbreak and hope, rejection and return, this emotional journey will remind you that every soul has a song worth hearing. If only we take the time to listen. Are you ready to hear it? Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. Get your hands off that piano, kid. This isn't your stage. The words crack through the cold morning air like a whip, sharp and loud enough to make heads turn along the cobbled square. People sipping lattes froze mid-sip. A mother tugged her daughter's hand a little tighter. The breeze carried the weight of those words like a shiver through the crowd. Elias didn't flinch. He sat on the weathered piano bench, barely intact, the fabric at the edge frayed and curling, and stared at the chipped ivory keys beneath his trembling fingers. His frame was small, his jacket 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a rope that had once held curtains in place. His sneakers were soaked from last night's rain, and his silence cut deeper than the officer's voice. "I said move." The officer stepped closer now. His badge glinted under the rising sun, his breath steaming in the morning chill. "You're not allowed to loiter here, much less put on a show for handouts." The boy's shoulders rose a little, whether in defense or defiance, no one could quite tell. The crowd hadn't yet gathered into a scene. Not yet. But a barista leaned her head out the cafe window. A tourist paused his camera. And an old man on the nearby bench narrowed his eyes behind bifocals. Still, Elias said nothing. His hands hovered over the piano as though they'd been mid-thought, interrupted. The way a writer freezes just before ink touches paper. But now, those hands lingered in the air, uncertain if it was still safe to breathe. "You deaf?" The cop pressed louder now. "Or just pretending you don't understand city law?" A seagull cried in the distance. Elias blinked slowly, but still didn't speak. His eyes weren't blank, they were vast, ocean dark, as if they held whole worlds behind them, too deep for words. He looked at the piano, then back at the officer. His lips parted, but instead of speaking, he lifted his right hand again, barely touching a single key. A soft note trembled into the morning, so gentle it might have been mistaken for wind, and the cop snapped. He grabbed the edge of the piano lid and slammed it down. The echo clanged through the square like a thunderclap, startling birds from a rooftop. Elias jumped back, stumbling off the bench. He nearly tripped but caught himself on the frame of the old upright. "No playing, no performing. This is not your corner, kid," the officer barked. "There's a shelter 3 blocks down. You want attention? Go there." Now people were watching. A teenager angled his phone discreetly. A young woman in scrubs stepped forward and opened her mouth, but then hesitated. The officer turned to the growing crowd. "This is exactly why we can't have leniency. One day it's piano music, the next it's camps in the streets. I'm doing my job." "He wasn't hurting anyone," a soft voice murmured. It came from near the cafe door. A waitress in a faded red apron, hair pulled into a neat bun, her eyes set like stone. The officer scoffed. "Letting him stay only encourages more. You think these instruments just show up by magic?" "That piano's been there for 3 years, she replied evenly. "It was donated by Mr. Landry after his wife died. Said he hoped someone would play her favorite waltzes again." The officer waved a dismissive hand. "City says it's abandoned, and I'm cleaning up." At that, the older man from the bench rose with difficulty and limped over. His cane tapped the ground slowly, rhythmically. "His name is Elias," the man said as if every syllable deserved reverence. "He plays here every morning, when most of us are still asleep. He doesn't ask for money, doesn't even put out a hat." The cop turned, squinting. "How do you know that?" "Because I listen," the man replied, his eyes not backing down. Elias stood motionless beside the piano, watching the conversation unfold around him like someone watching a dream fall apart. He wasn't crying. That would have made him easier to pity. He just stood, so still and silent he seemed like part of the background, like the lamppost or the old cobbled bricks beneath his feet. The officer stepped forward again. "Pack it up. If I see you here again, I'll cite you. Or worse." He turned to leave. But then, Elias did something unexpected. He didn't run, he didn't argue, he sat back down, just like that. He didn't even look at the officer. His fingers drifted to the piano, and before the cop could yell again, a chord spilled out, not loud, but deliberate. A low, sorrowful progression, minor and lingering. The officer froze mid-step. A hush swept through the square like fog on a quiet day. Even the cafe espresso machine hissed into silence. Elias's fingers moved again, weaving something more. Not flashy, not boastful, just heartbreakingly beautiful. A lullaby no one had heard before, but somehow everyone knew. It wasn't the kind of music made for money or applause. It was the kind meant to keep someone alive. The kind someone might hum in a shelter corner, alone in the dark. Notes that a child remembers long after his parents stop coming home. Music that survives where language fails. The officer didn't move. Elias didn't look up, he just kept playing. Deliberate, fluid, the way water makes its way around rocks. And slowly, people began to inch closer. Not with phones this time, not with judgment, but with reverence. The waitress leaned against the cafe doorframe, arms crossed, holding back something in her throat. The old man closed his eyes and tilted his face to the sky. The barista stopped making coffee. The boy kept playing. One hand drifted higher on the keys, ushering in a melody that rose like hope through a storm. The other painted shadows beneath it, low and aching, grounding the beauty in something unbearably real. Then something happened. The officer, stiff, stony, unmoved, let out a sound. Not a word. A breath. A breaking. He took a slow step backward, his boots crunching gravel like a man walking across shattered glass. Elias struck a final chord, 3 notes held in perfect unity, and the last sound lingered in the air long after the vibration left the strings. No one clapped. No one dared. Silence, full and reverent, blanketed the plaza. The officer looked down, then away, then to the piano. His hand moved, almost unconsciously, to his chest, as if trying to hold something in place that had been knocked loose. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because something inside him, something long buried, something he thought the uniform had replaced, had just been awakened. And Elias, the boy with nowhere to sleep and music written on his bones, didn't even raise his eyes. He simply rested his hands in his lap, the way a soldier might after laying down arms. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the plaza itself had forgotten how to breathe. The leaves paused in the breeze. The chatter of morning life, once a backdrop of clinking dishes and idle conversations, faded into the space between notes still hanging in the air. The officer stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling with a subtle tremor he couldn't suppress. His eyes had lost that cold, condescending steel they held before. Now they shimmered faintly, not with weakness, but with something far rarer. Recognition. The same way someone might react upon hearing a voice they thought they'd forgotten. A melody that unlocked a door sealed by years of silence. His lips twitched, not into a smile, but into something more vulnerable, uncertainty. Elias sat still on the bench, staring straight ahead. Not at the officer, not at the crowd. His back was straight, but his hands now rested in his lap like he had just given away the last secret he had left. And in a way, he had. He hadn't played for show. He hadn't played for sympathy. He had played to speak, to survive. Because the music was the only thing left in his world that hadn't betrayed him. The crowd remained hushed. The waitress was the first to move. She stepped forward, slowly, like someone approaching the edge of a dream they didn't want to wake from. "I don't know what that was," she whispered, just loud enough for the surrounding few to hear, "but I know it mattered." Behind her, the old man with the cane nodded. His voice, when it came, was like gravel soaked in warmth. That wasn't just music, that was a memory. The officer finally turned. His fingers flexed as if unsure whether to reach for his radio or his heart. He glanced at the piano again, then at Elias. "That song," he began, but the words collapsed before they could take shape. Someone behind him spoke up. a woman in her 30s with a baby sling across her chest. "My father used to play that when I couldn't sleep. I haven't heard it in 20 years. The officer looked over, startled, as if each person around him had suddenly stepped forward bearing fragments of his own soul. "No one taught him," the waitress added gently. "He listens. He remembers. That's all he has." "Where did he learn that piece?" the officer asked, his voice fraying at the edges. "Here," the old man replied. "From the wind, the people passing, the ghost of that piano's last player. Who knows?" The officer took a shaky step forward, then stopped. There was a tremble in his throat now, too strong to disguise. "That melody, I played that for my daughter once, the night before her surgery. I thought it would calm her. She was only 10. She swallowed. She didn't make it." The square seemed to still even further. Even the air leaned in closer. Elias turned his head, just slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to acknowledge. Their eyes met. Not long, not defiantly, but long enough to connect something unspoken between them. A kind of sacred grief, a shared ache shaped by absence. And in that glance, the officer was no longer the figure of authority, barking orders and drawing lines in the concrete. He was just a father who had once loved a girl with everything he had, and now stood, hollowed out, in the shadow of a song he never thought he'd hear again. The officer let out a breath he'd clearly been holding for years. "I was wrong," he said. "I thought I was protecting the city, keeping it clean. But maybe I was just trying to keep myself from remembering." He looked again at Elias. "I heard that song in a hospital room filled with tubes and fear, and today I heard it again, from a boy with no home, no voice, and more grace than I deserve." No one spoke. The waitress moved again, this time toward Elias. She crouched by his side and placed a gentle hand on the bench beside him. "You don't have to say anything, sweetheart," she said softly, "but I want you to know something. You made today different, for all of us." Elias blinked slowly. His lashes were thick with moisture, but no tears fell. "Not yet." The officer took another step forward. This time he bent slightly, just enough to meet Elias at eye level. "I owe you an apology, son. I didn't see you. I saw a label, a category, but you reminded me what it means to feel." Elias looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, with something deeper. Pity. Not because the officer was broken, but because he hadn't realized it until now. Then Elias did something no one expected. He raised his hand, placed it softly on the closed lid of the piano, and gently pushed it open again, revealing the keys like a priest opening a book of prayer. Then he stood, nodded once at the officer, and walked away. Not fast, not in shame, just quietly. Like someone who had just completed the most important performance of his life and no longer needed the spotlight. The crowd parted for him. He didn't ask for anything, didn't look back. He just moved with the grace of someone who had said all he needed to say through music that didn't belong to any language, but somehow spoke to every heart in the plaza. The officer stood motionless, watching him disappear into the edge of the street. The waitress crossed her arms, still beside the piano. "Do you still want him gone?" she asked the officer gently. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the crowd, then back to the piano. Slowly, he removed his hat and set it gently on the bench where Elias had just been sitting. And then he walked away. Not as a cop on patrol, but as a man returning to something he thought he'd lost long ago. The silence that followed wasn't hollow, it was sacred. Like after a prayer or a funeral, or a miracle you're still trying to understand. And though Elias had gone, the notes still floated in the air, whispers of a boy who didn't speak, but had managed to heal a stranger's grief with nothing more than 10 fingers and a borrowed melody. The rain came that night, soft and steady like a lullaby only the sky remembered. Elias sat beneath the overhang of a shuttered bookstore, knees pulled into his chest, jacket wrapped tight around his thin frame. He didn't complain. He didn't cry. The water whispered across the pavement in silver threads, and he simply listened. That was the thing about Elias, he listened better than most people breathed. His backpack, frayed and mended in odd patches, rested by his side. Inside were the only things he owned: a cracked photo of a woman holding a baby, a pair of socks too worn to be warm, and a folded sheet of music stained with time and something darker. Smoke, maybe. Or tears. The piano was gone. He'd walked away that morning knowing he might not find it there tomorrow. That was the nature of things in his world. nothing stayed. Not music, not mothers, not homes. But the song had lingered longer than he thought it would. A woman had brought him a cup of soup after sunset. She didn't ask questions, just set it beside him with a nod and walked off into the drizzle. Later, a man handed him a dry beanie and mumbled, "For what you did this morning, kid." Elias didn't understand what he'd done. He had only played what lived inside him. The pain, the memory, the fragments of lullabies his mother used to hum when the sirens wailed outside their apartment. He didn't know that his music had cracked open something in 100 strangers. He didn't know it had reached someone else, too. A white sedan idled at the corner. Inside sat a man with tired eyes, his badge removed, uniform shirt unbuttoned at the throat. Officer Bryant was not on duty, not officially. But his mind hadn't rested since that moment in the square. That melody, it had lived in his chest all day, crawling under his ribs like a ghost trying to speak. He hadn't expected the boy to leave so quickly, and he hadn't expected to care. Now he watched from the shadows, unsure of what he'd come to do. Apologize again? Offer a hand? Or maybe just make sure the kid had made it through the night. But when he saw Elias sitting there, damp but still, like a statue that refused to erode, he felt something tighten in his throat. The boy looked up. Their eyes met. Neither flinched. The rain thickened between them, but in that quiet moment, there was recognition. A second meeting, the kind not made of words. Bryant stepped out of the car, slowly. No sudden moves, no badge, no authority, just a man walking toward a child with nothing to offer but honesty. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, voice low, hands in his pockets. Elias didn't answer. He rarely did, but he tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in the man's tone. Bryant looked down at the wet sidewalk, then at the sky. "She used to play in the rain, my daughter," he murmured. "Said it made the world feel soft. Like music," she said, "even when everything else was hard." He exhaled, slow. "I haven't stood in the rain since her funeral." Still no response, but Elias's gaze didn't move. That was enough. "I wanted to say something more today," Bryant continued, voice rough now. "But I didn't know how. I still don't. All I know is, when you played that piece, I heard her again. For a moment, it was like she was here." Elias shifted slightly, and then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was there. "I don't know her song. I just played what hurt." Bryant froze. Those 6 words hit harder than any speech. "I just played what hurt." They carried the weight of a boy who had lost everything but still knew how to turn suffering into sound. It was a language most people couldn't speak, but Bryant understood it now. "You gave me something back today," he said quietly, "something I didn't know I needed. You reminded me I'm still human." Elias said nothing more. His eyes drifted to the puddles reflecting light from a broken street lamp. Raindrops danced like tiny ballerinas across the surface. Bryant reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out, a handkerchief, faded blue, stitched with the initials JLB. He crouched and held it out. "It was hers," he said. "Julia. She always brought it with her to recitals. Said it gave her courage. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I think you should have it." Elias stared at the cloth. He didn't move to take it, not right away. But slowly, gently, he extended his hand. Their fingers brushed, and in that single touch, there was something deeper than understanding. It was a passing of sorrow wrapped in grace, a bridge between a man trying to remember how to feel and a boy who had never stopped. Bryant stood. "I'll be around," he said, almost unsure if it was a promise or a hope. "And if you ever want to play again, I'll listen." Elias didn't respond, but as the man turned to leave, a single note echoed behind him. A soft G, then a D. Played not on keys, but on the lip of the coffee cup, tapped by a finger, rhythm, echo, message received, and Bryant smiled. He got back into his car, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't feel alone. Elias leaned back against the wall, wrapping the handkerchief carefully in the folds of his coat. He didn't know if it would keep him warm. But somehow, it did. Because sometimes, warmth didn't come from wool or fire, but from being seen. From knowing that even in the rain, even in the silence, even in a world that forgets the faces of boys like him, someone had remembered. The piano was gone the next morning. Elias arrived at the plaza just after sunrise, his breath curling like a ghost around him. The square was empty. echoing with the crisp footsteps of early commuters and the hum of distant traffic. He stood where the instrument once rested, where its chipped paint and sticking pedal had held his heart together, and found nothing but a shadow on the stone. Gone. Without a note. Without a trace. It shouldn't have surprised him. Nothing in his world stayed. Still, his fingers flexed as if they didn't believe it. They hovered in the air where the keys should have been, grasping at memory, trying to summon a sound that no longer had a voice. He let his hand drop to his side. He had never owned the piano. Not really. But it had been the only place where he became whole, where the boy without a bed, without a name on a mailbox, could be someone else, just for a little while. Didn't even leave a notice. Came a voice behind him. He turned. The waitress from the cafe stood at the edge of the plaza, arms folded, her apron dusted with flour. Her name tag read Mari, though she never offered it before. Her face looked softer in the morning light, like the hard edges she wore during rush hours were just armor. "City came last night," she said. "Said it was abandoned property, liability hazard." She shrugged, but there was sadness in the gesture. "I tried to stop them. So did Mr. Halverson, the older man with the cane. They didn't listen." Elias didn't speak, just stared at the empty square. Mari stepped closer. "They don't know what that piano meant, not just to you, to all of us. You turned that thing into something sacred." He gave a small nod. "It wasn't agreement, it was resignation." "I saved this," she said, and pulled something from the pocket of her apron. A key. Elias looked at it, confused. "Back panel key," she explained. "Used to be stuck inside the bench. I don't know if it means anything, but I couldn't let them take all of it." He reached out and took it gently. It was cold, heavy for its size. "Do you have a place to go today?" she asked, eyes searching his face. He shook his head. "You want breakfast?" He looked at her again, unsure if it was a trap or a kindness. But something in her face, tired but honest, told him it was real. She smiled, only a little. "Come on, before the morning crowd gets in." She turned and walked toward the cafe. Elias hesitated, then followed, the key clutched tightly in his palm. The warmth hit him like a wave as he stepped inside. Smells of fresh bread and roasted beans curled around him. There were plants in the window, chipped mugs stacked neatly, jazz humming low through an old speaker above the pastry case. It felt like a place where things stayed, where people remembered your name, your story, even the pieces you hadn't told yet. Mari pointed to a booth in the corner. "Sit. I'll get you something hot." He sat. The cushion squeaked beneath him. His knees bumped the table. A few moments later, she set down a plate, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, and a bowl of oatmeal with cinnamon. No questions, no lecture, just food. Just kindness. He didn't speak, but he looked at her, and it was enough. As he ate slowly, Mari leaned against the counter, watching him the way someone might watch a fragile painting. Like one wrong move could make the whole thing vanish. "Mr. Halverson told me something last night," she said softly. "He said you used to live near the harbor, that your mom used to play piano at some little jazz bar that burned down 3 years ago." Elias stopped chewing. "She had long braids," Mari continued. "Sang sometimes too. Called you her little echo." The fork slipped slightly in his hand. "I remember her," Mari whispered. "I served her once. She left a tip in the shape of a heart. I never forgot that." Elias lowered his gaze. "I don't know what happened after the fire," she said. "But I'm sorry." The ache in his chest tightened like a fist. He didn't cry. He never did in front of people, but he let himself breathe in the silence she gave him. That was something. She walked over again, placed a paper cup beside him. "Hot cocoa, extra cinnamon, thought maybe you haven't had one in a while." He nodded, whispered, "Thank you." It was the first word she'd heard from him. She froze. Then smiled slowly. "Anytime, sweetheart." He stayed there for an hour. Maybe more. Time didn't press on him here. It was the first place that hadn't felt like a hallway between shelters and sidewalks. It felt like maybe, just maybe, someone saw him. Later, as the cafe began to fill with regulars, Mari returned. "I want to show you something." She led him to the back, past the kitchen, past a dusty storage room filled with old chairs and holiday decorations. In the far corner, under a faded tarp and behind an old espresso machine, was a piano, not like the one from the plaza. This one was older, upright, missing a leg. One of the keys was taped with duct tape, but Elias saw it and stopped breathing for a second. I found it on a listing last winter, Mari said. Was gonna fix it up. Life got in the way, but if you want it, it's yours. He turned to her, stunned. I can't take. You can, and you will, she said, firm but warm. You play, that's who you are. We'll figure out a way to make it work. His hands moved without thought, reaching the keys, pressing one. It rang out, slightly out of tune. But it was beautiful. And suddenly, he didn't feel so alone. He returned every morning. Not to the square, but to the cafe's back room. The forgotten corner beneath flickering lights and crates of coffee filters, where an old piano waited like a wounded animal too proud to beg for attention. Mari had cleared the space around it. She'd moved the crates, swept the dust, and patched the broken leg with 2 bricks and a thick book of wine Perwin had opened in years. She hung a little string of yellow lights overhead. The bulbs blinked like sleepy fireflies, softening the warehouse walls into something almost gentle. Elias would arrive at dawn, always early, always silent. Mari would hand him a biscuit or a hot drink, never the same thing twice. Sometimes she said nothing, just nodded as he passed. Other times she'd mutter a joke or something about the weather, but the boy never responded. Not in words. He responded with music. The piano was rough, the E keys stuck. 2 black keys had chips in them like broken teeth. But in Elias's hands it came alive. Every flaw turned into character. Every imperfection was part of the song, and his music began to change. It still carried sadness, yes. That was always there. But now it had warmth threaded through it, like golden thread stitching wounds closed. A new melody emerged one morning. One that began with the same aching restraint but rose into something hopeful. Not loud, not showy. Just full of quiet resilience, like someone walking through snow, step by step, toward the light at the edge of the forest. Mari heard it and paused in the kitchen, her hands dripping with dishwater. That's new, she said aloud, though he couldn't hear her. And it was. Elias was changing too. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic way stories usually claim, but in small ways. He started to eat the food Mari gave him instead of saving it for later. He took off his coat in the back room once, folding it carefully and setting it aside before playing. He even smiled once, when a note surprised him, like the piano had told a joke, only he understood. The world outside didn't stop being cruel. The city was still cold, still hurried, still blind to boys with nowhere to sleep. But the cafe, this strange little haven of sourdough and second chances, had become a sanctuary. One rainy afternoon, the front bell jingled sharply. Mari looked up from the register and felt her stomach knot. It was the officer. Not in uniform. Bryant stood in the doorway, holding something wrapped in a plastic sheet. He looked uncomfortable in his civilian clothes, like a man caught halfway between who he was and who he wanted to be. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. Mari eyed him, wary, protective. "He's not here," she said before he could speak further. "I know," Bryant said. "I didn't come for him. I came for you." She blinked, surprised. He stepped forward and unwrapped the sheet. It was a folded flyer, weather-worn, torn at the edge, a city auction notice. "The Plaza piano," he said. "It went into city storage last week. I tracked it down." Mari looked at the paper. "They sold it?" "Not yet." He looked down, then up again. "I bought it this morning." Her eyes widened. "I want to bring it here. For him." Mari didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, she asked, "Why?" Bryant shifted. His voice cracked slightly. "Because I forgot what music was for, and he reminded me." Mari stared at him a long moment, then gave a single nod. "We'll need a dolly, and help." "I already asked a few guys on the force," he said. "They'll come after their shift." That evening, just after dusk, Elias came in with damp sleeves and a quiet step. He moved toward the back, expecting the usual flickering light and warm keys beneath his fingers. But he stopped. In the center of the room stood his piano, the same one from the square, the lid newly sanded, a fresh cloth draped over the bench. The faint scent of cedar oil hung in the air. He froze. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat like a sob that forgot how to leave. Mari stepped beside him. "He brought it back," she said. "Said it didn't belong to the city. Said it belonged to someone who made it matter again." Elias stepped forward. His hand shook as he reached out. Fingers brushing the familiar ridges, the stubborn crack by middle C, the carved initials someone had etched years ago. It was like touching an old friend thought long buried. He sat slowly. Then he played. He didn't warm up, Didn't hesitate, he just played. It wasn't sorrowful this time. It wasn't the melody of grief or ache. It was something simpler, something purer. Gratitude. It fluttered through the notes like sunlight through leaves. Hope stitched into harmony. Not loud, not perfect, but real. Bryant stood in the doorway watching. He didn't enter, he didn't interrupt, he just listened, eyes wet, hands in his pockets, heart laid bare. And in that moment, everything in the world, the cruelty, the loss, the noise, faded. All that remained was a boy and his piano, and the music that saved them both. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the man in the charcoal trench coat stepped into the cafe. The bell above the door gave its usual brittle chime, but Mari didn't look up at first. Her hands were deep in a bin of coffee beans, sorting out the cracked ones. The lunchtime rush had just passed, and she'd finally let herself breathe. But then she heard the voice. "Excuse me, I'm looking for a boy who plays piano." Her eyes lifted slowly, cautious. The man had silver in his beard and a leather-bound notebook under his arm. His shoes were polished, his eyes sharp, not unkind, but studying, the kind of look that weighed people before speaking. Mari straightened. "We have more than one boy who comes through here," she said. "Not like this one," he replied gently. "I saw a video online. He was playing in the square last month. Someone shared it. I've watched it a dozen times." She stiffened. She knew the video. One of the tourists had uploaded it. The morning Elias stopped the city cold with nothing but 10 fingers and a trembling melody. "He doesn't do performances," she said. "And he's not a story." "I'm not here for a headline," the man said. "I'm with the Easton Music Conservatory. I teach composition and scholarship students." Mari froze. The man went on. "I heard something in that boy's playing I haven't heard in a very long time. Truth. Raw, untrained, but unmistakable. Like the notes were connected directly to his heartbeat." She studied him. "And what would a school like that want with a homeless boy who plays an old piano in a storage room?" He didn't blink. To teach him, and to learn from him. She hesitated. Elias had trusted so few people in his life, and that trust had been earned through silences and patience, not promises. "I'd like to meet him," the man said, "if he wants." Mari's fingers curled slightly around the counter edge. Then she nodded toward the back door. "He'll be in there. Just go easy." The man walked softly. The light in the back room was dimmer that day. Clouds draped the sky like an old blanket. Elias sat alone, hunched slightly over the piano, fingers gliding quietly across the keys. The tune was unfamiliar, but it pulsed with breath, with thought. He was building something, note by note, delicate, hesitant, but growing. He didn't notice the man at first. The visitor stood quietly by the doorway, letting the music do the introductions. When Elias finally paused, sensing the presence behind him, he turned his head. The man didn't approach. He simply said, "That progression you just played, was that yours?" Elias blinked. He nodded once. "It's brilliant," the man said softly. "Simple. But the dissonance in the left hand, it's knowing, like you've already lived 3 lifetimes. Elias didn't speak. He looked wary, tired. The man stepped a little closer. "My name's Vincent Hale. I teach kids who were born reading Mozart, and I've taught kids who couldn't read a single note but carried entire symphonies in their heads. You're one of the latter, aren't you?" Elias shifted on the bench, uncertain whether to stay or flee. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Vincent said. "I'm here to offer something." He pulled out a small folder from under his arm and gently set it on the edge of the piano. Inside was a brochure. Crisp white pages, a photo of a grand hall filled with students, and a scholarship letter with a name line left blank. "I can't promise it'll be easy," he said, "but I can promise it's real. If you want a place to learn, a place to grow, there's one waiting." Elias stared at the paper. Not touching it, just watching. Vincent added, more softly, "I grew up in foster care. I didn't touch my first piano until I was 12, but someone gave me a chance." Silence hung like mist in the room. Then Elias spoke, barely audible. "What if I don't belong there?" Vincent's voice didn't hesitate. "You already do. The piano said so before you ever opened your mouth." Mari watched through the kitchen window, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes misting. It felt like watching a door open in real time. A door Elias didn't know existed. One that didn't lead to survival, but to something gentler. Something rare. Possibility. Elias didn't say yes that day, but he didn't say no. He returned the next morning, and the next. And slowly, curiosity crept into his music. His hands wandered beyond memory and started exploring. He replayed the melody he made when Vincent walked in, again and again, shaping it, reshaping it, bending it into something almost joyful. 1 week later, Vincent returned with a binder full of blank staff paper and a promise. "You don't have to leave the cafe yet. I'll come here, twice a week, if you'll let me." Elias nodded, and so it began. Lessons not in theory, but in trust, in finding voice, in creating something that didn't just echo pain, but reached beyond it. Mari offered soup during breaks. Bryant stopped by once a week, quietly checking in, sometimes bringing sheet music, sometimes just listening. Always with that same look in his eyes, that look of someone who knows he's witnessing something fragile and sacred. And word began to spread. A woman from the city's arts council came and offered to fix up the back room, donated a bench, a better light. A retired tuner volunteered to bring the piano to life again, one screw and string at a time. But Elias? He remained the same in the ways that mattered. Humble, quiet, still wearing the jacket with the rope belt, even after someone gave him a new coat. Still whispering more with his hands than his voice. But in his music, he bloomed. It wasn't just sorrow anymore. It was story. It was rising. It was rebirth. It was the first time he ever wore a button-down shirt. Mari had found it at the back of a local thrift shop. Navy blue, soft cotton, slightly too long in the sleeves. She rolled them up for him and smiled with approval as he looked at his reflection in the cafe's hallway mirror. Elias didn't speak, but he touched the collar thoughtfully, as if it didn't quite belong to him. But maybe, just maybe, he could grow into it. "You look good, sweetheart," she said. He glanced at her with a flicker of something quiet and fragile in his eyes. Not pride, not excitement, just the flickering light of someone beginning to believe they were allowed to be seen. The cafe had been transformed that morning. It wasn't grand, but it was something out of a dream. Tables pushed aside. Strings of soft bulbs crisscrossing overhead like stars drawn on invisible lines. A crowd had gathered. Teachers, neighbors, a few musicians from the conservatory, Bryant in a clean suit standing near the back, and even Mr. Halverson, the old man with the cane, wearing a tie so old it looked like it had witnessed history itself. At the center stood the old plaza piano, polished now, tuned to near perfection, its flaws preserved with affection. The chipped keys had been gently sanded, but not replaced. Vincent had insisted. "They're part of his voice," he'd said. "We don't erase character to create beauty, we use it." This wasn't a concert, it was a moment, a beginning. Mari gave Elias a nod from behind the counter, and slowly he walked toward the piano. No stage lights, no microphone, just one boy in a borrowed shirt standing in front of a world that had once turned its back. The room held its breath. He sat. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from reverence. This was not just an instrument. It was a home, one he had rebuilt from memory and melody. Then he began to play. The first note fell like a raindrop in spring, gentle, almost shy, but full of promise. Then another and another, weaving into something delicate like morning light creeping through broken shutters. It was the song he had written with Vincent, his first original composition. But it wasn't really new. It was made of old pain and new hope, stitched together like a quilt of everything he had lived through. He didn't look up, didn't need to. The music carried him. It rose slowly, cautiously at first. Then fuller, bolder. His right hand danced while the left anchored the rhythm, and the audience sat stunned. Not because he dazzled them with speed or grandeur, but because every single note felt honest. His song told the story of a boy who had lost everything, but never gave up listening. A boy who remembered the sound of his mother's voice more than her face. Who slept under awnings and between fears. Who survived not through fists, but through feeling. And now, here he was. Playing not to prove, not to perform, but to thank. Tears shimmered in Mari's eyes as she gripped the edge of the counter. She had known he was gifted. But this was soul work. This was healing. Bryant in the back didn't blink once. His jaw clenched slightly, remembering his daughter. Remembering the last time he had heard a piece that made him want to breathe slower. He pressed a hand to his chest and let the grief come, not with violence this time, but with grace. Vincent stood near the front, head bowed slightly, hands clasped. He was smiling, because this was what music was for. When Elias struck the final chord, 3 soft notes lingering in the air like a lullaby that didn't want to end, the room remained silent for a beat. Then another. And then, like dawn spilling over a quiet town, applause rose. Not thunderous, not wild, just steady, warm, like rain after a long drought. Elias looked up, finally, and what he saw changed something in him. Not pity, not amazement, just recognition. People were no longer seeing the boy who slept behind bookstores or played in the corner of a cafe. They were seeing the boy who belonged, who had a name, a voice, a song. He stood slowly. Mari walked over first, arms wide, and pulled him gently into a hug. "You did it," she whispered. Elias didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His hands, the ones that had once shaken when reaching for a single note, now held the world without fear. Later, when the cafe emptied and the lights dimmed, Bryant approached with a wrapped package. "Thought you might want this," he said, handing it over. Elias peeled back the paper carefully. It was a framed photo, black and white. A little girl at a piano, mid-laugh. Next to her, a man, younger, smiling. In the corner of the photo was a handwritten caption, "Julia and Dad, last recital." Elias held it gently. "She would have loved your music," Bryant said, his voice thick. "And I think she sent you to help me remember her." Elias looked up, then nodded once. A quiet promise. He would never stop playing, not for himself anymore, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, and everyone still waiting to be heard. The photograph stayed by the piano. Each morning, before he placed his hands on the keys, Elias would look at her face, the laughing girl caught mid-song, and her father beside her, frozen in a joy he once buried under duty and grief. The picture didn't just anchor the room, it anchored him. Sometimes Bryant came to listen, not always in uniform. More often now, he came in his old denim jacket, with 2 cups of cocoa in hand, one for Elias, the other left on the edge of the piano, just in case. They never spoke much. Words weren't necessary between them. Their silence was understood. What was broken had not been forgotten, it had been transformed. Spring crept into the city like a whispered promise. The air turned softer, the mornings brighter, and with it came something Elias had never known before: expectation. It wasn't the hungry kind, the kind that keeps you awake wondering where you'll sleep. It was quieter, steadier, like a path unfolding just ahead of his feet, inviting him forward. Vincent's lessons grew more challenging, though never rushed. They began composing duets. They studied music theory scribbled in notebooks. Elias didn't know how to read at first, but now studied with hungry eyes. His fingers flew across scales and harmonies like a boy learning to fly without ever leaving the ground. Word of Elias's gift had traveled beyond the cafe. One afternoon, a woman from the conservatory board arrived, dressed in cream linen and curiosity. She stood in the back of the cafe watching Elias play through a piece he had written about the night he lost everything, a haunting, hesitant waltz that tiptoed across grief like a child on broken glass. When the last note faded, the woman whispered to Mari, "It's not just talent, it's testimony." By summer, a letter arrived. It was thick, hand-delivered, the paper weighty and formal. On it, the Easton Conservatory crest, etched in gold, a full scholarship, room, board, mentorship. All of it. Elias held the envelope with both hands. It felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried, except maybe his memories. Mari stood nearby watching. "You can still say no," she said softly. "No one will think less of you." He opened the letter slowly, read the words or tried to, but it was never the ink that mattered. It was what it meant. Someone had written down in official language what no one had ever told him before. You matter. You belong. You're needed. He didn't cry. But he stood very still, the way someone might when they finally see the edge of a long tunnel and realize light wasn't a myth after all. That night, he stayed late at the cafe, alone with the piano. The city had gone quiet. Only the sound of passing cars and distant voices reached through the walls. Elias placed his fingers on the keys and played something he hadn't played in years. His mother's song. He hadn't remembered the whole of it. Just bits. A bridge here, a whisper of melody there. But now, with everything he had learned, with the pain and growth and new chords, he filled in the rest. It was gentle, intimate. A melody meant to be heard by one person and one person only. Somewhere in the middle of the song, Mari appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak, just watched, her eyes glistening. When he finished, she stepped forward and placed something beside him, a photograph. It was worn at the corners, the image slightly faded, but unmistakable. A young woman at a piano, braids down her back, a child in her lap, both of them laughing. "My sister took that," Mari said, voice soft. "Right before the fire." Elias stared at the image, afraid to breathe. "That's your mother," she continued. "She used to hum while she baked. You do that too, you know, when you're thinking." His throat tightened. He traced the edge of the photo like it was sacred. "Keep it," Mari said. He did. For the next few days he played every song he remembered her humming. Sometimes he'd mix them into classical pieces, hiding them like secret signatures between Chopin and Debussy. Other times, he'd just play her melodies over and over again, like prayers said with fingers instead of lips. Bryant came by once with a gift, a leather-bound journal with blank sheet music inside. "I thought you might want a place to put them," he said. Elias opened the first page, then wrote, not words, notes. He filled the lines with the stories he couldn't speak. The first song he wrote was titled Julia's Echo, not after the girl in the photograph, but after what she left behind. The second was called Rain on Stone. The third, Home. And by the time July came, the walls of the cafe's back room held more than just a piano. They held a boy becoming who he was always meant to be. They held the ghosts that had once broken him, and now stood beside him like pillars. They held the quiet magic that happens when someone dares to listen. The suitcase looked out of place in the cafe. Mari had placed it by the front door. Brown leather, old but solid, with a tag that read E. Hartman. No one had called him by that name in years, but when she gently placed it beside the door, Elias didn't protest. He just stood and stared at it. It was real now. Tomorrow morning, a black sedan from the Easton Conservatory would arrive to take him away. A private dorm, a new school, a campus with grand pianos and sunlit halls and students who read music like novels. Tomorrow his life would begin again, but tonight it was still his. The cafe had closed early for him. Bryant had insisted. Mr. Halverson brought in cookies and a vintage metronome wrapped in a cloth napkin. Vincent showed up in a pressed vest and brought a bouquet, not of flowers but of sharpened pencils tied with string. And Mari baked. She lined the counter with cinnamon rolls, carrot cake, a small peach cobbler, and Elias's favorite, banana bread with walnuts and chocolate chips. She didn't say much, but her hands trembled when she set the tray down. Elias didn't say much either. Not at first. He sat at the piano. Everyone else found seats or leaned against the walls. There were no speeches, no fanfare, just one request. Play. And he did, but not the songs they expected. He didn't begin with his compositions or the polished pieces he'd prepared for school. He played her songs, his mother's lullabies, the ones she used to hum while tying his shoes or braiding her own hair. The ones he hadn't known he remembered until they rose from his fingers like mist lifting off a lake. They filled the cafe not with applause but with peace. A few people cried, quietly, respectfully. Even Bryant, who had long since stopped hiding his tears, stood in the corner wiping his eyes with the same handkerchief Elias had once held in the rain. When the music stopped, no one rushed to speak. The silence that followed was richer than any ovation. Elias stood. He walked toward Mari. She opened her arms before he even reached her. "You don't have to say it," she whispered. "I already know." But he did say it. His voice, seldom used but now sure, spoke through the hush. "Thank you for being my home." She broke then, just a little, held him tighter. And then, quietly, Elias turned to Bryant. The man straightened unconsciously, blinking through damp lashes. Elias walked up to him and pressed something into his hand. It was a folded page of music, handwritten, the notes curved with his unmistakable script. Bryant opened it slowly. The title, Julia's Song, in Rainlight. "She'd be proud," he managed to say, voice thick. Elias just nodded. Later, when the night had thinned and goodbyes had been whispered at doorways and car doors, Elias returned to the back room one last time. He stood before the old piano, hands at his sides. He had never owned it, but it had saved him. He reached out and placed one final note, middle C, barely pressed, barely heard, like a blessing. Then he left the photo of his mother on the ledge, not because he was leaving her behind, but because she would always be the first music he ever knew. When he stepped out into the night, the wind greeted him gently, as if the city itself had softened. Mari waited by the curb with the suitcase. She didn't fuss. She didn't cry again. She just reached into her apron and handed him one last thing, a small wrapped parcel about the size of a matchbox. Inside, a thimble-sized music box. He turned the crank. It played the first 3 notes of his song. "You'll always have it with you," she whispered, and he would. As the black car pulled up under the streetlight, Elias turned one last time to look at the cafe. The lights glowed in the windows. The smell of cinnamon drifted faintly in the air. And though his steps were quiet, his heart was loud, not with fear, but with music. With love. With a life beginning, not because someone gave it to him, but because someone finally listened. 3 years passed. Seasons circled the city like soft waves lapping the shore. Spring melted into summer, then autumn painted the leaves in rust and gold before winter curled its fingers over the streets once more. Life changed, as it always does, but some stories linger in the corners of a place long after the people have moved on. The cafe was still there. The paint had faded a bit around the doorframe, and the bell above the entrance hung a little lower than before. But Mari still kept the counters spotless and the coffee strong. Customers still came in for her banana bread, still asked for the corner booth, and sometimes, when the sun hit just right through the windows, they swore they could still hear faint music echoing from the back room. Because even though Elias had gone, his song remained. Mari never moved the piano. She kept it tuned, polished, lovingly dusted. She'd drape fairy lights around it during the holidays, or place a vase of fresh daisies on its lid in spring. And once a month, like clockwork, she'd receive a letter, folded neatly, sealed with a wax stamp, addressed simply to the cafe that believed in me. Inside, a page of music, original compositions, each titled with care. Pastry Waltz, Hearthlight, A Girl Named Julia, and one day, near Christmas, a piece called Home is a Key Without a Lock. Mari framed every one of them. They lined the cafe walls now, a silent gallery of a boy's life written in notes instead of memories. Sometimes Bryant came in just to sit in front of the piano. He never played, never touched a single key, but he'd leave something behind. A coin from his daughter's last recital, a folded program, or once a little silver locket he swore had no real value but meant everything. He'd sit with a cup of cocoa, gaze at the framed sheet music, and whisper, "Still listening, kid." And Vincent? He came by less often. Teaching took him across states now, even across oceans. But every time he returned, he'd stop in for a strong cup of black coffee, walk to the back, and smile. "Still writing," he'd say with a grin, tapping the glass frame of the latest piece. "Told you he would." Elias had not just gone on to the conservatory. He had thrived. He'd become one of their most gifted and unorthodox composers, rarely speaking during classes, but always showing up with pages of music that silenced entire lecture halls. Professors wrote about his ability to translate memory into melody. Students said his music made them feel things they hadn't named yet. And when he performed, he still did what he always had. He listened. To the breath between notes, to the ghosts that waited in silence, to the life that rose from the cracks. Then, one spring, Elias returned. No announcement, no press. Just a soft breeze through the door as he stepped into the cafe, wearing a simple gray sweater, jeans a little too long, and that same quiet look in his eyes. Mari didn't speak at first. She just stared at him. Tears rising before words could catch up. He smiled, then held out a key. "I rented a space nearby," he said softly, "but I was hoping I could still play here." Mari covered her mouth and nodded, her shoulders shaking with quiet joy. "You never had to ask." That night, the piano came alive again. The cafe was full. Bryant, Mr. Halverson in a wheelchair now, even Vincent, who had caught a red-eye just to make it. New faces too, students, travelers. People who had heard rumors of the boy who once stopped time in a city square. Elias sat at the bench, older now, taller, more certain. But the way his hands touched the keys was still full of wonder. And when he played, it was not a performance, it was a return. He played everything, the cafe, the rain, the silence between strangers, the grief of a father, the hug of a waitress, the piano that waited. He played the boy he had been, and the man he was becoming. When he finished, there was no applause at first, just stillness. Then, one by one, people stood, not to cheer, but to honor. Because sometimes music is not meant to entertain. Sometimes music is meant to heal, to remind the forgotten that they are seen. to show that love, when given in quiet corners, can ripple across the world in sound, and that even a boy with nothing can leave behind a song that changes everything. Sometimes the world passes by the quietest souls, assuming they have nothing to say. But this story reminds us that the softest voices often carry the most profound truths. Elias had no home, no audience, and no applause. But he had a gift that healed not only his own wounds, but the pain buried deep in others. With each note, he didn't just play music. He told the story of survival, of grief, of quiet hope. He reminded a hardened officer of his humanity, restored a grieving father's heart, and rebuilt a community that had forgotten how to listen. The lesson is simple yet profound. Never underestimate the unseen, the unheard, the forgotten, because sometimes it's the child with torn shoes who carries the music that can heal a broken world. We all have the power to be like Mari, Bryant, or Vincent, to listen, to believe, to stand beside someone when they need it most. And to those who feel invisible, your voice matters. Your song is not lost. Keep playing. One day, the world will hear you. Because when grace and courage meet, even a single melody can change everything.